a couple little bookkeeping errors that may have been my fault at this point, because after all, we only got a start on this last time. Here's this from last time around. All right. Now, I forget what page in the textbook the material on syllogisms begins, but the author only gives you a handful of pages. I do have a lot more in my D2L module on that if you're interested, and I have some older video demonstrations of diagramming that we will be beginning a little bit of today. Don't worry about looking over those ahead of time, because I'm going to be doing what will be close to mirror duplicates of them in class. I will be using the same examples for consistency purposes. But just to get started, we introduced categorical syllogisms last time and some of the basics. Just to reiterate, categorical syllogisms are arguments that consist of how many statements? And by the way, this is the root word syllogism. They will always consist of 3 statements. 2 of those statements are what?
Premises.
Thank you. 2 are premises. 1 is a conclusion. Each statement will refer to 2 categories or classes of things or terms. Will refer to 2 categories of things. Now, the total argument, for the total argument, 3 categories will be referred to. Each will be mentioned twice, but not in the same statement. This is in my notes. This is also in previous, this is also in the lectures that I had linked online. However, the author of the text does not quite spell it out this neatly. So if you felt a little bit lost because the author didn't spell it out this neatly, I perfectly understand. I just ask you to give it a reasonable shot. Now, just to give you a diagram of a categorical syllogism. Now, folks, this one is a prototype. And I'm going to go over again the prototype that is in the textbook. The one about the Greeks and mortals and so forth. Recall this one said, all humans are mortal. All Greeks are humans. Therefore, all Greeks are mortal. Now I'm going to go over the anatomy of a syllogism. Now keep in mind that you already know that there are 4 kinds of statements that can be made. What we call A, E, I, and O statements, even though the text doesn't cover that terribly well. Each one of these statements is a what kind of statement?
All.
Yeah, these are all statements. We call all statements A statements. These are all A statements. And the textbook told you that the mood, every single syllogism can be designated by its mood. The mood of this syllogism is what? A. Why? Because this is an A statement, this is an A statement, and this is an A statement. Now, every syllogism will also have a figure. And typically, we will designate the figure right here. The figure will be designated by a what? The figure will be designated by a number. And by the way, if this stuff is totally new, no big deal, like so many things, you just gotta learn it. The figure will be designated by a number. Well, what the heck does the figure refer to? The figure will refer to, and I'll write this down here, it refers to the position of, and the text mentions this once and doesn't quite give it enough conversation, in my opinion. The figure will refer to the position of the middle term. Any guess what the middle term is? Hoover? Not quite. The middle term will be in the major premise and the minor premise. The middle term in this syllogism prototype is humans. The middle term will be found in both statements, and because each statement is used twice, guess where the middle term won't be found? Yeah, the middle term will not be in the conclusion. The middle term will be found in each of the premises. The way the middle term is positioned will be one of the main indicators of whether or not the syllogism will end up being valid or invalid. Because the middle term will be the term that will either succeed or fail to connect the two premises together logically. But in this case, the middle term is humans. Now, the author of the text told you that this one was first figure. When the middle term is the subject of the major premise, and the predicate of the minor premise, we say that is first figure. Now, I'm going to come back to what the other figures are in just a minute. But I first want to complete this anatomy of the syllogism that we were working on last time, and I didn't quite get to complete because of time constraints. Now, remember, the tail end of a statement we call the predicate. The front end we call the what? Yeah, subject. Yeah, these are pretty mundane, commonplace terms that you've heard elsewhere. Predicate and the subject. Now, folks, the predicate of the conclusion we call the predicate of the conclusion the major term. So if I refer to the major term, I am talking about whatever is the predicate of the conclusion. Now, because this one's called the major term, any guess what this one's called? Yeah, the minor term. The minor term will always be the subject of the conclusion. Now, I've kind of already cheated on my next statement I was going to make. Whichever premise contains the major term, when we put a syllogism in standard form, we place it first. So you see, the major term is mortal. The major term is found in the major premise. That is the correct ordering of a syllogism. We call it standard form. The minor term will be found in the premise that we place second. Now I want to give you a side note here. The order in which we state the premises is irrelevant to whether or not the syllogism will be valid or not. However, if I ask you to put it in standard form, this is what you have to do for form purposes. Now, the reason why the order of our premises is irrelevant to whether or not the total argument is valid or not is because of a concept that you learned way back when in a math course. It's called the commutative property. How many of you remember that? Good, good. The commutative property, recall, said that it didn't matter what order the two numbers that you either added or multiplied together were. You would still end up with what? Yeah, the same result. Well, the same principle applies here too. Even if somebody weren't to write the syllogism in standard form, it would still be valid or invalid, regardless. Hoover.
So I was actually, before you said that, I was actually going to ask if you could switch the major and minor premises. Like, it still wouldn't matter because you'd get the same conclusion. But like, what is like the defining factor that like you know something is in standard form? Because if you could switch them, then like how?
Well, if I ask you to put it in standard form, whatever the major term is will be found in the premise that you put first. Okay. Whatever is the minor term will come. The minor term will be placed in the second one. Now, you could successfully determine validity or invalidity if you put it into standard form or not. It's just that if you were asked to give me the standard form mood and figure, your mood and figure would be off. Wouldn't be a logical error. It would be what I would call a bookkeeping error. It would be a bookkeeping error. But if you're asked to put a syllogism in standard form, take a look at the conclusion. The major term is the predicate. We place that, the premise that contains it first. Minor term, we place that second. Now, you'll notice if these two were turned around, we'd have the same mood, but we'd have a different what? We'd have a different figure because then the middle term would be here and here rather than here and here. So we would have a different figure. Now, this is not in the book, but it is in my notes. You will need to know it for upcoming quizzes and other material. Because you're going to be asked to put syllogisms into standard form for Friday's homework, I should probably make sure I tell you now how to determine what the figure of a syllogism is. The bad news is you're just going to have to memorize this. Although there are what I would like to call some devices that can easily help you to remember it. But yeah, you just have to memorize it. And by the way, if you've taken A&P, Anatomy and Physiology, now that's memorization. This is not much. If you've taken Organic Chemistry, there's some memorization for you. So yeah, if you're going to complain about memorization, this is actually kind of small stuff by comparison. So anyway, it's really not that much to memorize, but you've just kind of got to do it. And by the way, the more you see it, the more likely it will sink in. I will shut up about that. Now, how do we determine figure? We have first figure when the middle term is the subject of the major premise and the predicate of the minor premise. So if it's in standard form, it will look like this. Here and here. So I just draw it like that so you can remember it. Figure 2 is when the middle term is the predicate of the major premise and the predicate of the minor premise. So in other words, it will be here. If the middle term were here and here, we would have second figure. Figure 3 is when the middle term is the subject of the major premise and the subject of the minor premise. Figure 4, any guesses? I already said it, actually. You have only one option left. Yeah, figure 4 is when the major, or rather, when the middle term is the predicate of the major and the subject of the minor. Looks like this. And for those of you in video land, first figure, second figure, third figure, fourth figure. It's not exactly a mnemonic device, but it is sort of an image that you can remember if you sort of forget. First figure, second figure, third figure, fourth figure. Don't worry, it sinks in with practice. Now recall we already went over the fact that there are only four kinds of statements you can make in categorical syllogisms. A statements, all P or Q. We'd already said that there are E statements, no P or Q. I statements are some P or Q. And then finally, O statements are some P are not Q. I will be writing those down on the board again in the second part of our lecture. So guess what we're going to do now?
Watch a video?
No. Go over the homework from last time. I prefer not to show videos in class because I figure